Tokyo Bay, September 2, 1945. A gray morning mist drifts over the still water as the Japanese delegation boards the USS Missouri. The air tastes of salt and smoke, the residue of cities burned to ash. Cameras click, pens scratch, and signatures seal the end of an empire. Beneath the calm surface, Japan lies in ruins. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, names that now mean dust. Factories silent, rail lines twisted. Families living in the skeletons of their homes. Millions displaced, millions starving. And from faraway camps, from Guam to the Philippines, Japanese prisoners of war begin to hear whispers America will rebuild Japan. To them it sounds impossible. The same nation that unleashed the bomb now promising food, medicine, and a new future. Yet within days, American aircraft drop rice instead of fire. Within weeks, engineers and administrators arrive not as conquerors, but as planners. The occupation begins, not with vengeance, but with blueprints. August 1945, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. Its cities were smoking ruins, its railways crippled, and its population starving. By the end of that summer, more than 60% of urban housing lay in rubble. The once proud Imperial Navy was at the bottom of the sea. The empire that had stretched across Asia was gone, dissolved in weeks by atomic fire and Soviet assault. When Emperor Hirohito's voice reached the nation on August 15, 1945, many citizens fell to their knees, weeping, unsure whether to feel shame or relief. For the first time they had heard his voice, a voice surrendering unconditionally. Soldiers lowered their flags. Children bowed toward radios. The war was over. But peace offered no comfort. Japan's home islands were barely functioning. Famine loomed, production had ceased, and disease threatened to finish what the bombers had begun. Millions of demobilized soldiers and returning Padus would soon flood back to a land that could no longer feed them. In Washington, the American leadership debated what to do with a defeated Japan. Some demanded harsh punishment to dismantle the nation that had unleashed Pearl Harbor and Bataan. Others, led by President Harry S. Truman, saw a deeper purpose. The United States had not only won a war, it now held the power to shape a civilization. Thus emerged one of the most ambitious social experiments in modern history, the Allied occupation of Japan. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, representatives of Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender before General Douglas MacArthur, the newly appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. SCEP. MacArthur, a man of towering ego and calculated discipline, would become both ruler and reformer of Japan for the next 7 years. His arrival in Tokyo on August 30 was choreographed with symbolic restraint. No parades, no revenge. He stepped onto Japanese soil wearing an open-collar shirt, pipe in hand, a quiet signal that this occupation would be different. His orders were clear: demilitarize Japan, democratize its institutions, and stabilize its economy. But how to achieve that among ashes? The first challenge was survival. The winter of 1945 threatened mass starvation. Allied estimates suggested Japan's rice harvest would feed the population for only 6 months. MacArthur immediately ordered emergency shipments of grain, flour, and medical supplies from U.S. stockpiles. To the Japanese, who had endured years of enemy bombardment, these relief flights were surreal. The same aircraft that once brought destruction now delivering food. At the same time, SCEP teams began dismantling the military machine. Over 7 million soldiers were disarmed and sent home. Weapons were melted, uniforms collected, and factories once producing Zero fighters now retooled for civilian goods. Occupation troops were under strict discipline. Theft and harassment were punished harshly to maintain an image of moral authority. But beneath the surface of order was uncertainty. No one knew how long the Americans would stay, or whether Japan would ever stand again. The old elite, from generals to industrialists, faced purges. The imperial bureaucracy still functioned, yet its spirit was broken. And across the Pacific, American policymakers feared a deeper enemy rising: the spread of communism through Asia's ruins. So the occupation's mission widened. Reconstruction was no longer just mercy, it was strategy. To stabilize Japan was to build a bulwark against the next ideological war. In the bombed-out streets of Tokyo and Osaka, this policy took shape in small gestures: food kitchens, medical teams, rebuilding crews clearing rubble by hand. MacArthur's staff calculated every calorie, every ration, as if they were rebuilding not only a nation but a soul. Still, for the returning Japanese POWs, disbelief lingered. Many had expected imprisonment or execution. Instead, they found American officers distributing food to their families, organizing schools, reopening rail lines. They walked through cities they no longer recognized, hearing foreign soldiers speak of democracy and freedom, as if these were materials to be imported alongside grain. By late 1945, the occupation's machinery was in motion, bureaucratic, complex, and meticulously planned. It would take years to see its true purpose, but already one truth was emerging: America was rebuilding Japan not to erase it, but to transform it. The ruins had become a blueprint. By the start of 1946, the American occupation of Japan had shifted from crisis management to systematic reform. The immediate threat of famine was easing, but the deeper challenge remained: how to rebuild a defeated empire into a stable democracy without igniting rebellion or humiliation. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo's Daiichi building became the nerve center of transformation. Behind its guarded doors, thousands of Allied officers, economists, lawyers, and social scientists worked under the banner of SKP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Their mission was sweeping: dismantle Japan's military, reform its political system, stabilize its economy, and remake its society. It was an operation unlike any in history. Never before had a modern industrial nation been so thoroughly defeated, and then placed entirely under foreign administration. Every order, from school curriculum to factory output, flowed through American channels. To the Japanese, this was both bewildering and strangely efficient. The occupation government kept the emperor, the symbolic heart of Japan, on his throne, but stripped him of political power. It was a delicate balance. Removing Hirohito risked chaos, keeping him offered continuity. In a single stroke, MacArthur preserved Japan's unity while severing its imperial ideology. Demilitarization came first. The once mighty imperial army and navy were abolished. Soldiers turned to laborers. Arms factories were converted to produce pots, pans, and bicycles. By early 1946, over 5,000 military-related corporations had been shut down or redirected. Japan's war ministry was replaced by a new Ministry of Welfare, symbolizing a nation turning from conquest to recovery. Next came democratization, the moral cornerstone of the occupation. SIP's Civil Information and Education section flooded the country with pamphlets and radio broadcasts teaching democratic principles. Political prisoners were freed. Women were granted the right to vote in the April 1946 elections, which drew an astonishing 67% turnout, including millions of first-time female voters. For the Japanese public, these changes felt both liberating and disorienting. Centuries of hierarchy were being dismantled within months. Newspapers published editorials on freedom of speech, a phrase many had never read before. Teachers, once required to bow toward the emperor's portrait each morning, now taught civic responsibility and individual rights. But democracy alone could not fill empty stomachs. Japan's economic structure was still paralyzed. Production in 1946 stood at barely 10% of its pre-war level. Inflation soared, and black markets thrived in the shadows of burned-out cities. To survive, families traded heirlooms for rice, and American GIs quietly bartered rations for souvenirs. Recognizing the need for stability, SKP turned to the foundation of Japan's economy: the zaibatsu, the powerful industrial conglomerates that had fueled the empire's war machine. MacArthur's economic advisors, many drawn from New Deal backgrounds, saw these corporations as both the problem and the key. They ordered the dissolution of major zaibatsu groups like Mitsubishi and Mitsui, breaking their monopolies to encourage competition and decentralized ownership. At the same time, land reform began reshaping rural Japan. The government bought large estates from absentee landlords and sold them to tenant farmers at fair prices. By 1950, nearly 40% of all farmland had changed hands, one of the most successful agrarian reforms in modern history. For ordinary Japanese, these transformations were staggering. Villagers who had lived under landlords for generations suddenly owned their soil. Women held office seats. Schoolchildren studied democratic ideals written by former enemies. The psychological shift was immense. Defeat was no longer shame, it was opportunity. Throughout these reforms, American troops maintained a remarkable discipline. Reports of misconduct were rare. U.S. soldiers played baseball with children in ruined parks, shared rations with families, and helped rebuild schools. Photographs from 1946 show an almost surreal calm. Occupation forces walking unarmed through Tokyo's shattered districts, greeted not with hostility, but with curiosity. Yet behind this atmosphere of cooperation, the Cold War was emerging. In Washington, policymakers grew anxious about communist influence across Asia, from Mao's China to Korea's instability. Japan, once the enemy, was now seen as a potential ally in a new ideological struggle. Thus, by late 1946, the occupation began to pivot. Reconstruction was no longer just about redemption, it was about containment. The United States would not merely rebuild Japan, it would reforge it into a democratic bulwark facing the communist East. Factories that once forged steel for tanks now produced machine tools for export. Schools emphasized science and industry. The US dollar and Japanese yen became entwined through financial reforms that stabilized inflation and linked Japan's recovery to American aid. The foundation was set. But the human experience, the way former soldiers, prisoners, and civilians perceived this transformation, would define whether this occupation succeeded or collapsed into resentment. And it was here, in those human stories of disbelief, adaptation, and gradual hope, that the next chapter of Japan's rebirth unfolded. When the war ended, over 1 million Japanese soldiers were held in captivity across Asia and the Pacific. Many had endured years of starvation, forced labor, or brutal internment. For them, returning home in 1946 and 1947 was not triumph, it was disorientation. They stepped off ships onto docks that no longer resembled Japan. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Factories where they once worked now lay in fragments of steel. And yet, what stunned them most was not the destruction, but the faces of their former enemies. American soldiers unloading sacks of flour, engineers surveying bridges, medical officers tending to Japanese children. Men who had expected change found cooperation instead. The image of the barbaric American from wartime propaganda evaporated under the weight of canned food and penicillin. Many ex-POWs wrote home describing their confusion and awe that a nation capable of such destruction would also be capable of rebuilding their homes. A former Japanese naval officer later recalled, "They fed our families before we could feed ourselves." This quiet humanitarian effort became the emotional foundation of the occupation. The Americans were no longer faceless conquerors, they were visible agents of change. Schoolteachers, nurses, and administrators began to see collaboration not as betrayal but survival, and then, gradually, progress. Yet this cooperation came with an unspoken tension: the Japanese people's deep sense of collective guilt and shame. Defeat had stripped them of identity, but the rebuilding offered something unexpected: dignity through work. Clearing rubble, repairing rail lines, or serving as clerks in newly formed local offices was not just labor. It was a moral rehabilitation, one task at a time. Behind every act of kindness was a disciplined, militarized system. The American occupation of Japan was not spontaneous goodwill, it was one of the most organized logistical operations in modern military history. At its peak, the Allied occupation force numbered nearly 400,000 troops, primarily American, scattered across the islands to ensure order. MacArthur structured this force like a campaign, precise, layered, and controlled. The initial mission: secure disarmament and prevent chaos. Ports were seized, arsenals catalogued, and weapons collected under strict supervision. Former soldiers were processed with bureaucratic efficiency: registration, health check, ration cards, discharge certificates. Over 5 million weapons were surrendered in a matter of months, from rifles to aircraft. But unlike Germany, Japan's occupation relied heavily on symbolic power rather than force. American troops rarely patrolled with rifles in hand. Instead, they stood as reminders, quiet sentinels of a new order. Their discipline was essential to preventing rebellion. MacArthur knew that legitimacy mattered more than intimidation. He issued strict directives: no fraternization beyond official duties, no looting, and no personal involvement in Japanese politics. To most Japanese citizens, the occupation forces appeared almost monastic, efficient, silent, and just. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army's logistical divisions orchestrated massive reconstruction tasks, restoring water supply to Tokyo, reopening the Yokohama docks, and distributing food through thousands of relief stations. The U.S. Navy handled maritime transport of supplies, while the Air Force managed aerial logistics, dropping essentials to isolated islands and mountainous regions. The success of this tactical organization astonished foreign observers. Within 6 months, Japan's major urban centers were stable, violent crime was minimal, and local governance had resumed under SCEP oversight. The operation demonstrated a rare blend of military precision and humanitarian administration, a model that would later influence U.S. occupations in Germany, Korea, and beyond. To the Japanese public, this efficiency seemed almost alien. The same army that once embodied destruction now functioned as a machine for reconstruction. In this inversion, the psychological war was won. The occupiers had not only conquered Japan's territory, they had conquered its despair. When American survey teams first mapped post-war Japan, they found a nation on the verge of collapse. Only 30% of the rail network remained operational. Bridges were gone, ports silted, and factories stripped bare. Power generation had fallen to less than 1/5 of its pre-war capacity. Tokyo's population of 7 million faced daily blackouts and contaminated water. To rebuild Japan's skeleton, SCEP mobilized engineers from both sides, American and Japanese. The civil engineering and public works sections began clearing rubble and reconstructing vital arteries, rail lines, roads, ports, and communication cables. The goal was not only to repair, but to modernize. Within a year, locomotives began running again between Tokyo and Osaka. The Tokaido line, once targeted relentlessly by Allied bombers, became the symbol of recovery. Bridges rose in steel instead of wood. Telecommunication lines were reconnected, linking ministries, factories, and schools into a single network of reconstruction. American industry contributed spare parts and technical guidance, but the work itself was Japanese. Engineers, technicians, and laborers, many of them ex-soldiers, found purpose in rebuilding. They worked alongside U.S. advisors to rewire power stations and standardize industrial output. By 1947, the results were visible: ports reopened for trade, urban trams resumed operation, and city lights flickered again for the first time since 1944. Each light bulb illuminated more than a street. It marked a psychological victory. In parallel, U.S. planners understood that technology was political. Rebuilding infrastructure meant embedding American systems, measurements, materials, and methods into Japanese industry. Factories adopted new standards, electrical systems were calibrated to U.S. voltages. Management philosophies began to mirror Western practices. This infusion of technology and method laid the groundwork for what would later be called the Japanese economic miracle. But at this early stage, it was fragile. Every ton of steel, every repaired machine, represented a line of trust between occupier and occupied. To the returning prisoners and civilians watching their cities flicker to life, it was proof of something almost spiritual: that destruction could be reversed not by pride, but by precision. 3 dimensions: human emotion, tactical discipline, and technological ambition were converging. Together, they transformed defeat into design and subjugation into structure. But beneath this apparent unity, deeper questions remained. Who truly controlled Japan's rebirth? Was it the Americans shaping the blueprint, or the Japanese quietly steering it to their own ends? Those questions unfold next in the policies, decisions, and moral contradictions of power. No man embodied the paradox of Japan's occupation more than General Douglas MacArthur. He ruled from his office overlooking the imperial palace, a conqueror who became a constitutional architect. Every directive bore his initials, every law required his approval. The Japanese called him the blue-eyed shogun. MacArthur understood symbolism. He rarely appeared in military uniform beyond his trademark cap and pipe. His authority flowed not from weaponry, but from poise. He cultivated an image of calm inevitability, the impression that his vision was destiny, not policy. From the start, MacArthur's leadership blended military command with statesmanship. He allowed the emperor to remain a figurehead, preserving Japan's unity, while quietly dismantling the structures that had empowered its militarism. He surrounded himself with experts, economists, educators, legal scholars, many of whom were veterans of America's New Deal reforms. In 1946, MacArthur's staff drafted what would become the Constitution of Japan in less than 2 weeks. It was a radical document. It renounced war as a sovereign right, guaranteed freedom of speech and religion, and enfranchised women. The most transformative clause was Article 9, declaring that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a means of settling international disputes. MacArthur personally reviewed every line before it was presented to the Japanese government. When critics in Washington called it reckless, he stood firm. He believed that disarming Japan morally was as important as disarming it militarily. His command was absolute, yet he rarely raised his voice. He issued orders as if they were laws of nature. Under him, bureaucrats moved with missionary efficiency. Every Japanese ministry answered to a SCIP division, every governor's office followed an American manual. Still, MacArthur's rule was not without friction. Some Japanese leaders felt humiliated by the pace of reform. Others, especially younger officials and intellectuals, saw him as the father of a new Japan. The general's portraits appeared in homes, shops, and even shrines. To millions, he was the man who ended their hunger, brought peace, and shielded them from harsher Allied punishment. He had, in effect, become an emperor of a different kind, not through divine right, but through bureaucracy. An empire of paper and will. While MacArthur wielded power through charisma, another transformation was happening quietly through economics. Japan's recovery would not come from charity alone. It required re-engineering the entire structure of production and ownership. Before the war, Japan's industrial might was dominated by the Zaibatsu, powerful family-run conglomerates like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Sumitomo. These corporations had financed military expansion, controlled trade, and merged state ambition with private profit. To American planners, they represented both efficiency and danger. The machinery of aggression disguised as commerce. SCAPE's Economic and Scientific Section, ESS, led by General William Marquardt, launched an ambitious program to dissolve these monopolies. Thousands of holding companies were dismantled, shares were redistributed to smaller investors. Antitrust laws, modeled on U.S. reforms, were imposed to ensure competition, but dismantling the zaibatsu was only the first act. The deeper goal was to stabilize the yen, curb inflation, and rebuild productivity. American economists introduced new fiscal policies, balanced budgets, credit controls, and a fixed exchange rate. The Dodge Plan of 1949, designed by Detroit banker Joseph Dodge, imposed strict austerity, cutting government spending while promoting exports. At first, the effects were painful. Factories struggled, wages froze, and unemployment rose. Yet these short-term hardships laid the foundation for long-term growth. By forcing efficiency and export orientation, the Dodge Plan turned Japan into an industrial engine aligned with U.S. markets. Simultaneously, land reform transformed rural society. Millions of tenant farmers, once bound to landlords by centuries of debt, became landowners. Agricultural productivity rose sharply, fueling food security and rural stability. This reform did more than feed people. It diffused power, ending the feudal remnants that had sustained militarism. By the early 1950s, Japan's economy was stirring back to life. Textile exports resumed. Steel and shipbuilding rebounded. The Reconstruction, once dependent on U.S. aid, began to sustain itself. The American planners' paradox became clear: to make Japan independent, they had to make it dependent first on American systems, markets, and money. And as the Cold War deepened, this dependence became a strategic alliance. The factories that once served the empire were now producing for America's side of the ideological divide. While engineers rebuilt cities and economists rebuilt markets, another struggle unfolded in the courtrooms of Tokyo. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often called the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, sought to bring Japan's wartime leaders to justice. Beginning in May 1946, the tribunal charged 28 senior officials, generals, admirals, politicians, with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The proceedings lasted more than 2 years. Witnesses testified about massacres in Nanking, forced labor, and prisoner abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, but the moral terrain was uneven. To many Japanese, the trials felt like victor's justice, history written by those who had dropped the bomb. Yet to others, they offered closure, a chance to separate individual guilt from national identity. The executions of 7 convicted leaders in December 1948 marked an end to one chapter of accountability, but the questions lingered. Beyond Japan's borders, the world watched cautiously. Asian nations demanded reparations, while Western allies debated whether the U.S. was remaking Japan too leniently. In China, the trials were seen as selective. In America, they were seen as moral necessity. But perhaps the most significant moral act was the one MacArthur refused to take: the prosecution of Emperor Hirohito. Washington's decision to shield him was strategic. Punishing the emperor might have shattered Japan's fragile unity. Instead, he was transformed into a symbol of peace. In 1946, Hirohito renounced his divinity in a national radio address, calling himself a human being. It was one of the most profound psychological moments in Japan's modern history. The world that had once seen Japan as an aggressor now began to perceive it differently, as a laboratory for peace. Photographs of smiling children receiving American milk powder, of women voting for the first time, of cities rising from rubble. These images circulated globally as proof that Reconstruction could follow devastation. Still, moral contradictions persisted. The same occupation that preached democracy censored criticism of Allied policies. The same America that rebuilt Hiroshima continued testing nuclear weapons elsewhere. Yet for the Japanese people, the balance was clear. Survival outweighed bitterness. By 1949, the nation's narrative had shifted. Japan was no longer a defeated enemy, but a disciplined student, one learning the lessons of democracy under the guidance of its former foe. And soon, the Reconstruction that began as occupation would reach its decisive turning point. The moment when Japan would stop being rebuilt by America and start rebuilding for America. By 1950, Japan was still recovering, industrially weak, politically restrained, and economically dependent on American aid. Then, one unexpected event transformed everything: the outbreak of the Korean War. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, invading the South. The United States, under the United Nations banner, rushed to intervene. Yet the nearest logistical base capable of supporting such a massive military response was not in Korea, it was in Japan. In a single week, Japan's role changed overnight. From a defeated nation under occupation, it became America's arsenal and staging ground for war. Yokohama's ports filled with ships, factories that had been dismantled or idle since 1945 roared back to life. Foundries reopened, steel mills rekindled their furnaces. Dock workers, engineers, and machinists worked around the clock supplying the U.S. war effort. This was not Reconstruction anymore, it was acceleration. The American military poured billions of dollars into Japanese contracts, trucks, uniforms, engines, food, and ammunition. Within a year, the influx of orders reached 500 million, more than the entire per-war export value of Japan. Economists later called it the special procurement boom. For ordinary Japanese workers, it meant wages, stability, and the return of pride in labor. Factories in Nagoya and Osaka that had once built aircraft now produced vehicles and machine tools for American forces. Shipyards repaired U.S. transports. Electronics firms like Toshiba and Matsushita supplied communications gear. The occupation authority watched in astonishment as industrial output surpassed pre-war levels by 1952. The irony was striking. A war in Korea had become the engine of Japan's peace. Yet the Korean War did more than revive Japan's economy, it transformed its psychology. For years, many Japanese had lived in a shadow of guilt and defeat, convinced their nation's identity had ended with surrender. The war next door reawakened something different. A sense of necessity, even mission. Factories were no longer symbols of militarism, but of contribution. American officers now treated Japanese engineers as partners, not prisoners. Local newspapers printed photographs of Japanese ships carrying supplies marked, UN Mission, Korea. For the first time since 1945, Japan was participating, indirectly, in international action, and this time on the side of collective defense. MacArthur himself saw opportunity. He believed the Korean conflict could cement Japan's role as a bulwark of freedom in Asia. In private memos, he urged Washington to speed up Japan's rearmament. Though the 1947 Constitution forbade offensive forces, the U.S. approved the creation of the National Police Reserve in 1950, the seed that would later grow into Japan's self-defense forces. In the streets of Tokyo, opinion was divided. Pacifists saw rearmament as betrayal of the peace clause. Others saw it as protection, a necessary measure in a world once again torn by war. But regardless of debate, one truth was clear. Japan's future would no longer be defined by ruins, but by relevance. The factories, schools, and ministries rebuilt under American oversight had become the foundation for sovereignty. And slowly, American officers began stepping back. Civil administration returned to Japanese hands, the occupation's rigid control loosened, replaced by collaboration. The final act of transformation came in 1951. Representatives from 48 Allied nations gathered in San Francisco to sign a treaty formally ending the occupation and restoring Japan's independence. On September 8, Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida signed the Treaty of Peace with Japan, pledging cooperation, democracy, and peaceful development. The document did not erase the scars of war, but it confirmed Japan's return as a sovereign nation. Yet even in independence, America's influence endured. Alongside the peace treaty, Japan and the United States signed the Security Treaty, granting the U.S. the right to station forces on Japanese soil. For Washington, Japan became an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a permanent anchor for its Pacific strategy. For Tokyo, it was a pragmatic compromise of freedom under protection. As MacArthur watched the signing from afar, his command having ended that April, his vision had already taken root. Japan was reborn not through subjugation but through redefinition. Its factories, universities, and constitution now formed the architecture of a modern democracy. By April 28, 1952, the occupation officially ended. The American flag over the Daiichi building came down. Japanese flags rose once more across the islands. Crowds filled the streets of Tokyo waving both American and Japanese colors, not as symbols of surrender or dominance, but of shared survival. The same nation that had once sought to conquer Asia now became the cornerstone of America's peace in Asia. Behind this transformation lay an invisible victory, one not measured in land or battles, but in perception. The world had expected resentment, rebellion, even collapse. Instead, Japan had emerged as proof that occupation could heal rather than humiliate. The rebuilding of cities like Hiroshima turned into a global symbol of peace, captured imaginations far beyond Asia. Students studied under rebuilt schools with American textbooks, artists and writers wrestled with the moral paradox of gratitude toward a former enemy. By 1953, Japan's GDP had doubled from its 1946 level. Industrial exports were reaching new markets, and as American GIAs departed, many left behind a generation of Japanese who spoke English, read democracy, and dreamed of technology, not conquest. Yet beneath the success lay a quiet disbelief, especially among returning soldiers and prisoners of war. They had seen the Japan of ashes and despair. Now they stood in cities glittering with neon lights and rebuilt railways. For them, America's reconstruction of Japan defied everything they had been taught about victors and vanquished. And soon, they would see it firsthand, not through reports, but through the eyes of those who had once fought against America. The next act would belong to them, the witnesses of defeat returning to a nation they could barely recognize. For many Japanese soldiers, the war did not end in 1945. Hundreds of thousands had been captured by Allied or Soviet forces and sent to camps across the Pacific, Siberia, and Southeast Asia. Some endured years of hard labor before being released. Their memories of the enemy were frozen in time, images of firebombed cities, destroyed ships, and starving civilians. When they finally returned home, between 1947 and 1950, depending on where they had been held, they expected to find a nation humiliated, occupied, and broken. Instead, what awaited them was something few could comprehend. Ships carrying returning Palus docked in Yokohama and Kure. Men disembarked in tattered uniforms, emaciated and weary, bracing for pity or scorn. But along the docks were Americans and Japanese civilians distributing food, cigarettes, and warm clothing. Medical teams examined each man before sending him to rehabilitation centers. These were not the conquerors they had imagined. For months, MacArthur's occupation headquarters had prepared for this moment. Repatriation was not only a humanitarian act, it was a message. The Americans wanted every returning soldier to witness what Japan had become in an orderly, functioning, and peaceful society rebuilt under Allied guidance. In Tokyo, the contrast was overwhelming. Where once lay miles of charred ruins now stood clean, repaired streets lined with shops. Children carried American textbooks. Trains ran on time, factories hummed again, and towering above it all were signs of industry. Reconstruction cranes, smoke from steel mills, power lines stretching across the horizon. Some returning officers wept quietly, others stared in disbelief. How could this be the work of an occupying army? One former lieutenant from the Imperial Army, interviewed in 1952, described his first walk through the Ginza district of Tokyo. I expected to see ruins. Instead, I saw lights. American soldiers buying noodles from street stalls, Japanese girls in Western dresses, children laughing. I could not understand what had happened. To him, the greatest shock was not material but moral. The realization that the enemy had rebuilt what his own government had destroyed. For many returning POWs, the transformation forced a reevaluation of everything they had believed about the war. Propaganda had told them Americans were cruel, barbaric, and bent on Japan's annihilation. Yet the streets of Tokyo told a different story, one of order, aid, and strange respect. Even those who had suffered in Allied camps found their anger fading as they saw the scale of reconstruction. The United States had not only fed Japan, it had given it a model, democracy, technology, education, that no empire in Asia had ever offered. Of course, not all accepted it easily. Some veterans saw the new Japan as soulless, a nation trading its pride for prosperity. They struggled to find purpose in a society that now valued productivity over honor. But for others, especially the younger soldiers, there was gratitude, even awe. Many wrote letters home describing the surreal coexistence between occupiers and occupied. The Americans, one soldier wrote in 1948, are teaching us how to live, not how to die. The industrial revival these men witnessed was not accidental. Under American supervision, Japan's great conglomerates, Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toyota, were being reorganized, retooled, and redirected toward civilian production. Engineers trained in pre-war militarism were now designing sewing machines, typewriters, and radios. The Economic Stabilization Board, created under SCAP, tracked every ton of coal, every shipment of steel, rebuilding the industrial spine that would soon astonish the world. For the returning POWs, the sound of machines was the sound of rebirth. Factories once bombed by B-29s now produced tractors and automobiles for export. Shipyards in Kobe and Yokosuka built merchant vessels under U.S. contracts. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, balancing the labor shortage with efficiency unseen before. When the first Toyota Essa sedan rolled out in 1947, it was small, slow, and simple, but symbolically enormous. Japan was no longer a nation that built weapons. It was a nation that built the future. The soldiers who had fought in jungles and deserts now found jobs on assembly lines or in offices, contributing to a new kind of national mission. Peace through productivity. As the decade progressed, America's role evolved from occupier to partner. U.S. engineers trained Japanese technicians in electronics, metallurgy, and management science. Economic missions, led by men like Joseph Dodge, introduced monetary reforms that stabilized the yen and encouraged entrepreneurship. By 1953, the results were undeniable. Japan's gross national product had doubled since the surrender. Exports climbed each month. Radios, textiles, and machinery replaced silk and coal as primary goods. But the real transformation was invisible: a change in values. The cult of sacrifice that had driven wartime Japan was replaced by the pursuit of mastery, of doing things better, faster, smarter. Precision became the new patriotism. For returning POWs who had seen only loss, this quiet revolution felt like a miracle. They had expected to come home to defeat. Instead, they came home to renewal. In 1952, during a public ceremony marking Japan's regained sovereignty, a group of repatriated soldiers watched as the American flag was lowered for the last time at the Dai-ichi building. Nearby, a young girl released a handful of white balloons into the sky. One of the men whispered, "They conquered us without hatred." It was not admiration, it was revelation. The realization spread among veterans, journalists, and intellectuals alike. America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the rebuilding of its enemy. That understanding, painful, humbling, and transformative, became the true climax of Japan's post-war journey. The same men who had once sworn to die for the emperor now worked to build televisions, cars, and machines that would soon dominate global markets. They no longer marched with rifles, they built with precision tools. And as they did, the world began to watch in disbelief, just as they once had, at how Japan had risen again. By the mid-1950s, the transformation of Japan was undeniable. What began as an occupied, starving nation had become one of Asia's fastest recovering economies. The combination of U.S. aid, Japanese discipline, and a national drive to restore dignity created an unprecedented phenomenon later called the Japanese economic miracle. Factories that had once been silent now produced goods for export to Europe, Southeast Asia, and even the United States. Radios, sewing machines, and bicycles filled the markets. Within a decade, Japan's industrial output surpassed pre-war levels by more than 350%. In Washington, economists who had once predicted that Japan would require decades of foreign assistance now spoke of self-sufficiency. And in Tokyo, American advisors began withdrawing, leaving behind an administration confident enough to chart its own course. The Yoshida Doctrine, named after Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, became the nation's guiding principle. Japan would rely on the United States for security while focusing its resources on economic recovery. It was a pragmatic alliance, protection in exchange for progress. Under this shield, Japan's industries soared. The U.S. provided markets, technology, and political stability. Japan provided manpower, innovation, and efficiency. Together they forged an unspoken partnership that reshaped Asia's future. The most striking evidence of recovery could be seen in Japan's cities. Tokyo, once flattened by the firebomb raids of 1945, had become a construction site of optimism. Skyscrapers rose where ash had fallen. Streetcars and buses crisscrossed avenues lined with neon lights. In Hiroshima, the city that had symbolized the end of one era, the Peace Memorial Park became the symbol of another. Designed not for vengeance but for reflection, it drew visitors from around the world. Students and veterans walked its paths together, reading inscriptions that spoke of memory and hope. Osaka's factories ran 24 hours a day. Yokohama's port was crowded with merchant ships again. Nagoya became the hub of automobile manufacturing, while Kobe specialized in steel and shipbuilding. The rhythm of industry was everywhere, fast, disciplined, unstoppable. For returning soldiers and citizens who had known only scarcity, this growth felt miraculous. The same generation that had once dug air, raid trenches was now building television towers. The contrast was staggering, from surrender to skyscrapers in less than a decade. But Japan's reconstruction was not only economic, it was deeply social. The 1947 Constitution, drafted under American guidance, had redefined the structure of the nation. It introduced universal suffrage, guaranteed freedom of speech and religion, and established equal rights for women for the first time in Japanese history. In classrooms across the country, children studied a new curriculum, one that emphasized critical thought over blind obedience, peace over aggression. Teachers who once lectured about imperial destiny now taught civic responsibility. The emotional climate of the nation was shifting from fatalism to determination. The land reforms of 1946-1949 broke up vast estates, giving small farmers ownership of their plots. For millions of rural families, this was liberation, economic democracy replacing feudal tradition. And yet, throughout these reforms, one thing remained uniquely Japanese: discipline. The people accepted austerity with calm. Savings rates were among the highest in the world. Efficiency became a moral duty. In factories, workers took pride not only in productivity but in perfection. This quiet cultural revolution, combining Western structure with Japanese spirit, became the heart of the nation's rise. Internationally, Japan's resurgence reshaped how the world viewed both victor and vanquished. For America, the success validated its post-war strategy. The occupation of Japan stood as proof that a defeated enemy could become a democratic ally, a striking contrast to the turmoil in post-war Europe and the Soviet-controlled East. For Asia, Japan became an example, a nation once synonymous with aggression, now symbolizing modernization. Its engineers and manufacturers exported not only products but methods, precision, punctuality, and relentless pursuit of improvement. For the Japanese themselves, the transformation brought pride mixed with humility. Many older citizens still carried the weight of wartime memories, of loss, surrender, and the mushroom clouds that ended an empire. Yet their children saw a different Japan, one defined not by the sword, but by the circuit, the car, and the camera. By the end of the 1950s, few could deny it, America had rebuilt Japan not through domination, but through partnership. And in doing so, both nations had changed. The next stage would test that partnership, as Japan stepped fully into independence and the world began to feel the power of its resurgence. By the early 1960s, Japan was no longer rebuilding, it was leading. The economic miracle that had begun under American oversight now gathered unstoppable momentum. Exports surged across every category: automobiles, cameras, semiconductors, and precision instruments. In 1964, less than 2 decades after its defeat, Japan hosted the Tokyo Olympic Games, a global spectacle symbolizing rebirth. Television screens around the world broadcast images of bullet trains, modern architecture, and the rising skyline of a nation reborn. For millions watching, it was difficult to believe this was the same country that had been in ruins in 1945. The Shinkansen, Japan's high-speed train unveiled that year, became the icon of this transformation, sleek, silent, and ahead of its time. It represented everything post-war Japan had become: disciplined, innovative, and forward-looking. Factories that once turned out warplanes now produced automobiles for peaceful mobility. The same companies, Mitsubishi, Nakajima, now Fuji Heavy Industries, and Kawasaki, were reborn as civilian industrial giants. The science that once fueled destruction now powered efficiency and precision. American observers who had served in the occupation returned decades later to find a Japan that seemed almost futuristic. A society of neon cities, organized transit systems, and technological mastery. What had started as an experiment in democracy had become an industrial phenomenon. Yet prosperity did not erase memory. Beneath the surface of achievement ran an undercurrent of reflection, the haunting awareness of what had been lost and what had been rebuilt. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors of the atomic bombings, the Hibakusha, became living witnesses to both suffering and survival. Their testimonies filled classrooms and documentaries, shaping Japan's pacifist identity. The new constitution's Article 9, renouncing war as a sovereign right, became not only law but national conscience. Cinemas filled with post-war films that wrestled with these themes: duty, guilt, and rebirth. Directors like Akira Kurosawa and Masaki Kobayashi explored the moral contradictions of the war years, capturing a nation's struggle to understand itself. In literature, authors like Yasunari Kawabata and Kenzaburo expressed both nostalgia and responsibility, the delicate balance between pride in survival and sorrow for the past. Even the presence of American culture, once seen as foreign and intrusive, evolved into integration. Jazz, baseball, and Hollywood films mingled with Japanese art, tea ceremonies, and festivals. Tokyo became a crossroads of East and West, modernity and memory. For many veterans and returning POWs, this coexistence still felt surreal. They had seen Japan's absolute defeat. Now they saw their children playing baseball under American lights, attending universities built with American funds, studying technologies that would one day surpass America's own. But the overwhelming emotion was not resentment, it was gratitude, not to a conqueror, but to a second chance. In Washington, the success of Japan became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. By rebuilding Japan, the United States had gained not just an ally, but a model. Proof that the tools of democracy and economics could achieve what bombs could not. The same logic would later guide Reconstruction efforts in Germany, South Korea, and beyond. Yet no other case was quite like Japan's. The transformation had gone beyond politics. It had touched the moral core of two nations. American soldiers who had once fought in the Pacific now returned as businessmen, engineers, and tourists, welcomed with respect. In letters and memoirs from the 1960s, many expressed the same astonishment once felt by Japanese POWs that out of hatred had come partnership, and out of total destruction, peace. For Japan, the relationship was complex but indispensable. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1960 reaffirmed America's military presence, sparking protests from pacifists but guaranteeing stability. While the Cold War raged elsewhere, Japan thrived in relative peace, its industries untouched, its resources devoted entirely to growth. By the end of the 1960s, Japan's economy ranked second only to the United States. The world's newspapers now used a new phrase, "Made in Japan." What had once meant cheap imitation now stood for precision and reliability. Sony's transistor radios, Nikon's cameras, and Toyota's cars became symbols of a new global standard. For America, it was both a triumph and a revelation. The nation it had defeated now competed with it in markets around the world. Yet this competition was peaceful, built on trade, not war. And for Japan, the victory was spiritual. The pride lost in 1945 had been regained, not through conquest, but through creation. The transformation was complete. A generation that had known only ruin now led the world in science, technology, and culture. The children of surrender had become the architects of modernity. But behind every skyscraper and invention lay an unspoken truth. That all of it began not with power, but with mercy. That mercy had changed history. In the quiet hours of post-war Japan, a new kind of silence settled, not the silence of defeat, but of understanding. The streets that once echoed with air raid sirens now rang with the sounds of bicycles, children, and distant trains. Factories hummed again, not for war, but for life. For the first time in its long history, Japan had found strength not in the sword, but in surrender, and in the mercy that followed it. The story of America's kindness to Japanese prisoners of war and civilians was never one of charity. It was something deeper. An act of faith in human nature itself. At a time when vengeance would have been easy and perhaps expected, compassion became the instrument of victory. That choice, quiet, deliberate, almost invisible, changed the course of nations. Historians can measure economies, treaties, and tonnage, but they cannot fully measure the moment when one soldier handed water to his enemy, or when a young Japanese boy first tasted American bread after years of hunger. Those small moments carried more weight than tanks or treaties. They built the moral bridge that made everything else possible. The men who once fought each other in jungles and oceans grew old in a world their mercy helped create. A world where former enemies became allies, and where the ruins of war gave birth to skyscrapers and peace treaties. Today Japan stands as one of America's closest partners. A democracy, a technological leader, a voice for stability in Asia. The alliance that began in rubble has endured wars, recessions, and generational change. It stands not because of dominance, but because of trust. The kind first born in Padao camps and rebuilt cities. In the museums of Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor, visitors from both nations stand side by side. They read the same inscriptions, look at the same photographs, and reflect on the same truth. That humanity's worst days can still give rise to its finest acts. What began in 1945 was not merely the end of a war. It was the start of a quiet revolution. One built on mercy, patience, and the refusal to let hatred have the final word. The true victory was not written in surrender documents nor in economic charts, but in the unseen transformation of hearts. Empires fall, cities burn, but kindness endures. In the ashes of war, it became the rarest weapon of all, and the most powerful.